No, this can't be true. They are alive.
3 days. That was all it took to destroy everything Kang Min-Jae believed about his own life. 3 days after he watched his wife dragged onto a plane and sent away forever, a small, unmarked package arrived at the gates of his mansion in Seoul. There was no name on the sender's line, no return address. Only his own name, written in handwriting that made his blood turn cold, because it was handwriting he thought he would never see again. Inside the package, wrapped in plain brown paper, were 4 objects that would break him slowly, piece by piece. A photograph of a woman he did not recognize, standing beside a child. A hospital document, stamped and sealed, bearing a name that had been buried for 2 years. A small silver bracelet, scratched and worn, the kind made for a baby's wrist. And a folded note, written in trembling letters that seemed to have been pressed onto the paper with great effort and greater fear. Min-Jae read the note only once. But once was enough to make the most powerful man in the Kangcrime syndicate sit down on the marble floor of his own foyer like a man who had lost the ground beneath him. The note did not beg. It did not accuse. It asked him a single, devastating question. It asked whether he had ever truly confirmed that his son was dead, or whether he had simply chosen to believe it, because believing it was easier than asking why his wife had never let him see the body. To understand how a man like Kang Min-Jae arrived at this moment, kneeling on his own floor with his hands shaking around a piece of paper, we have to go back. Back to the woman he loved without limits. Back to the decision that would come to define the rest of his life. 3 years earlier, Naomi had been the last person anyone expected to marry into one of Seoul's most dangerous families. She had come from Lagos with nothing but a scholarship and a fierce, unshaken sense of who she was. She met Min-Jae not through the world of crime and power that defined his life, but through an art exhibition his mother had dragged him to, one he had planned to leave after 10 minutes. He stayed for 3 hours instead, unable to look away from the woman who spoke about color and grief in the same breath, who carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that made hardened men in his world go silent. Their marriage was not simple. Min-Jae's world was built on secrecy, loyalty, and violence disguised as business. Naomi entered it with open eyes, choosing him anyway, choosing to build a life inside walls that most outsiders never survived. On the day they married, in a private ceremony. Overlooking the Han River, his mother had taken Naomi's hands and told her, quietly, that a woman who could walk into this family without flinching was rarer than any jewel Min-Jae could ever give her. For a while, that promise felt true. Naomi filled the cold marble hallways of the mansion with color, with laughter, with a warmth the household had not known since before Min-Jae's father died. She gave him a son. She gave him, for the first time since his father's death, a reason to imagine a future that did not revolve entirely around power. Min-Jae, a man other bosses in Seoul feared enough to avoid eye contact with, would come home some nights and simply sit beside the nursery door, listening to his son breathe, as if the sound itself was proof that a life built on violence could still produce something untouched by it. Then came the accident. The official story, the one that spread through the household like poison, was simple and cruel. Their infant son had died of a sudden illness while Naomi was alone with him, and in her grief, or perhaps in some deeper betrayal no one wanted to name aloud, she had failed to call for help in time. Whispers followed. Whispers about a woman seen leaving the estate, about medical records that seemed incomplete, about Naomi's strange silence in the weeks after the funeral, a silence that looked, to those eager to judge her, like guilt. Min-Jae, blinded by grief and fed a steady diet of suspicion by the people closest to him, began to believe the story more than he believed his own wife. He stopped asking her what really happened. He stopped looking at her the way he once had. And into that widening crack walked Soo-jin, gentle, patient, endlessly understanding, always present with soft words exactly when his grief was heaviest. The final blow came on a gray morning in early spring. Min-Jae's most trusted advisor placed evidence in front of him, documents suggesting Naomi had been secretly meeting with a man connected to a rival syndicate, transferring money to accounts outside the country, preparing, it seemed, to disappear with information that could destroy the Kang family from within. Naomi did not defend herself the way an innocent woman was expected to. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply looked at Min-Jae with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. An expression that held no fear, only a terrible, aching sadness, as if she had always known this moment would come and had already made peace with it. Within 48 hours, her visa was revoked through channels only a man like Min-Jae could control. Rain fell over Incheon that morning, thin and cold, streaking the windows of the black car that carried her away from the only home she had built in Korea. She was escorted to the airport not by police, but by his own men who would not meet her eyes as they walked her toward the gate, their silence heavier than any accusation could have been. Before she boarded, she turned to him one final time. She did not ask him to reconsider. She did not raise her voice. She only said in a tone barely above a whisper that one day he would understand, and that when he did, she hoped he would be able to forgive himself. Min-Jae watched her walk away through the glass, her shoulders straight, her steps unhurried, a woman who looked less like someone running from guilt and more like someone walking toward a sacrifice she had already accepted. Min-Jae told himself he felt nothing as he watched the plane disappear into the clouds. He told himself this was justice, that a man in his position could not afford weakness, that betrayal deserved exactly this kind of ending. He would repeat this story to himself so many times over the following weeks that he almost believed it. Soo-jin moved into the mansion less than a month later. The household staff adjusted quickly, a staff in a place like that always did, folding her presence into the daily rhythm as though she had always belonged there. She was warm where Naomi had become distant. She was agreeable where Naomi had once challenged him. For a while, Min-Jae mistook this ease for healing, but small things began to gnaw at him in the quiet hours before sleep. The way Soo-jin sometimes hesitated before answering questions about her past. The way she seemed to know details about his organization that he had never shared with her. The way one of his oldest guards, a man who had served the Kang family for over 20 years, watched her with an expression Min-Jae could not quite name, something between suspicion and old, buried grief. He pushed these thoughts away, the way he had trained himself to push away anything that threatened the fragile peace he had built, until the package arrived. It came exactly 3 days after Naomi's deportation, delivered by a courier no one at the gate could later identify or trace. Inside, the photograph of the unfamiliar woman and child. The hospital document with his dead son's name stamped across the top, dated weeks after the boy's supposed death. The small silver bracelet, identical, impossibly, to the one that had been buried with his son's body. And the note, asking the question that would not let him sleep again. Because if his son's bracelet was sitting in his hands right now, untouched by 2 years of Ertan time, then what, exactly, had been buried in that small white coffin? For the first time in 2 years, Min-Jae found himself unable to trust the story he had built his grief around. He returned, alone and unannounced, to the private hospital where his son had supposedly died. He requested the original medical file, not the summary his advisors had shown him at the time, but the complete record, signed by every doctor and nurse who had been present that night. What he found made his stomach turn. The death certificate bore 2 different signatures for the attending physician, in 2 visibly different sets of handwriting. The recorded time of death did not match the time listed on the ambulance dispatch log. And most disturbing of all, the doctor whose name appeared on the final certificate had left the hospital's employment less than a week after signing it, and had not been heard from since. Min-Jae sat in his car outside the hospital for nearly an hour, gripping the steering wheel, replaying 2 years of grief through a lens he had never allowed himself to use before. If the certificate had been altered, then someone inside that hospital, someone with access and authority, had helped hide the truth of what really happened to his son. And if that was true, then Naomi's silence, the silence he had mistaken for guilt, might have been something else entirely. Before leaving the hospital grounds, Min-Jae drove to the small private cemetery on the northern edge of the Kang family estate, where a white marble headstone bore his son's name beneath a single carved angel. He had not visited in months, unable to face the weight of standing there. Kneeling in the wet grass, he noticed something he had never thought to check before. The stone bore a date of burial 3 full days after the date listed on the falsified death certificate, a gap no grieving father should have had the composure to notice, and one that no one around him had ever bothered to explain. He began to remember details he had dismissed at the time. The week before their son's supposed death, Naomi had begged him, with unusual urgency, to increase security around the nursery. She had asked him, more than once, whether anyone outside the family had access to the boy's medical records. He remembered brushing off her concerns, telling her she was letting new motherhood make her anxious, never imagining that she might have been afraid of something real. He also remembered, with a fresh and painful clarity, the last conversation they had before the accusations against her began. She had tried to tell him something, standing in his study with the door closed, glancing repeatedly at the window as though afraid of being overheard. She told him that if anything ever happened to their son, he should never trust the official explanation, no matter who delivered it to him. At the time, he had thought grief was making her speak in riddles. Now, sitting alone with a hospital file that told a different story than the one he had accepted for 2 years, he understood that she had been trying to warn him, and that someone close enough to know her plans had made sure she never got the chance to finish. If a story like this keeps you desperate to know what happens next, you already understand why so many people come back to this channel every single week for more stories exactly like it. Make sure you are subscribed, because what Min-Jae discovers next will change everything you think you understand about Naomi and about the people closest to him. That evening, Min-Jae noticed Soo-jin slip quietly into his study while he was away and quickly close a drawer he kept locked, the same drawer where he had hidden the package and its contents. When he confronted her, gently at first, she offered an explanation so smooth and immediate that it should have reassured him. Instead, it unsettled him further, because she had answered a question had not yet asked. Later that night, unable to sleep, he watched from the shadows of the upper hallway as Soo-jin slipped out into the garden beneath a thin, restless moon. She stood near the koi pond, phone pressed to her ear, her posture tense in a way he had never witnessed from her before. He could not hear every word carried on the wind, but he caught enough. He heard her say that the package had already been sent, and that it was too late to stop what had been started. He heard her say a name headed not recognize, a name spoken with the kind of familiarity reserved for someone she read to, not someone she simply knew. For the first time since Naomi's deportation, Min-Jae felt something colder than grief settle into hishist. Suspicion. He turned to the one person in his organization he still trusted without question, an old guard named Hyun-woo, who had served his father before him and had never once given him reason to doubt his loyalty. When Min-Jae described what he had heard in the garden, Hyun-woo's expression changed in a way that frightened him more than any threat he had faced in years. The old guard admitted that he had long suspected something was wrong with how quickly Soo-jin had entered their world, how easily she had learned the rhythms of a household most outsiders needed months to understand. Together, they began quietly investigating her background, calling in favors from contacts wooed the Kang family silence rather than loyalty. What they uncovered chilled Min-Jae to his core. Soo-jin's identity, the entire history she had presented to him, the grieving cousin of a family friend, the humble woman with no connections to his world, had been carefully constructed. Beneath it was a name connected to a syndicate. The Kang family had fought for control of Seoul's underground for over a decade, a rival family that had never forgiven his father for the territory he had taken from them years earlier. Min-Jae stood in his study that night, staring at a woman's photograph, the same soft, gentle face that had shared his bed and his grief for the past year, and understood with sickening certainty Thatch had never loved him at all. She had been placed there, watching him, waiting. And whatever she had been sent to find, it seemed increasingly likely to be connected to the son he had believed was dead. Armed with the truth about Soo-jin, Min-Jae moved quickly and quietly, calling on contacts across 3 countries to trace the woman he had once cast away without a trial. It took less than 2 days to learn that Naomi had not simply been deported and abandoned to fate, as he had assumed. She had been living under a different name in a small town outside Lagos, working under careful protection that someone, somewhere, had arranged for her, though she had no memory of requesting it herself. When Min-Jae finally reached her, standing outside a modest house with paint peeling from years-off sun and rain, Naomi opened the door and looked at him the way a person looks at a storm they have been bracing for. She did not look surprised to see him. She looked, instead, like a woman who had been waiting for this exact reckoning for 2 long years, uncertain whether it would arrive as forgiveness or as another form of danger. Inside that small house, Naomi finally told him everything she had been forced to carry alone. Weeks before their son's supposed death, she had discovered that someone inside the Kang organization was feeding information to a rival syndicate. Information about the family's movements, their security, and most dangerously, about their child. She had gone to the one person she believed could protect the boy without exposing him to more danger, Min-Jae's own mother, a woman whose quiet strength Naomi had trusted instinctively from the very beginning. Together, without telling Min-Jae, they staged their son's death using a sympathetic doctor willing to falsify the records, believing that a grieving father, blinded by loss, would be far less dangerous to the rival syndicate than a living target guarded by a man they could still threaten. Naomi had wanted, desperately, to tell Min-Jae the truth, but his mother had warned her that the mole inside their household was too well placed, too dangerous, and that even a single slip could put both Min-Jae and the child in the rival family's hands. So Naomi carried the lie alone, allowing herself to be painted as a traitor, allowing herself to be sent away in disgrace, because it was the only way to keep her son, and eventually Min-Jae himself, safe from a war he did not yet know he was fighting. Soo-jin, it turned out, had been sent by that same rival family nearly a year after the child's stage death, not to find a boy they believed was already gone, but to search for proof of exactly what Naomi and Min-Jae's mother had done, evidence that could be used against the Kang family for years to come. The package, Naomi now revealed with trembling hands, had not come from an enemy at all. It had come from her, smuggled out through an old contact, the only way she had left to make Min-Jae start asking the right questions without directly breaking the silence she had sworn to keep. Min-Jae returned to Seoul that same week, standing once more in his mother's private sitting room, the same room where he had once received her comfort after his son's funeral. This time, he did not ask for comfort. He asked for the truth. His mother, the formidable and unshakable matriarch of the Kang family, did not deny a single word. She told him that protecting her grandson had meant protecting him from the one person capable of exposing the plan without meaning to. And that person had been Min-Jae himself, consumed as he was by grief and rage in those early days, watched constantly by enemies looking for any crack in his composure. She led him, finally, to a quiet countryside home 2 hours outside the city, tucked behind a standoff pine trees where the air smelled of wood smoke and cut grass. An elderly caretaker she trusted completely had been raising a little boy under a different name for nearly 2 years, teaching him to walk, to speak his first words, to laugh, all of it happening far from the empire that would one day belong to him. The moment Min-Jae stepped through the doorway and saw his son's face, alive and healthy and utterly unaware of the danger that had once surrounded his very first days of life, something inside the Mafia boss that had been frozen since that terrible spring finally broke open. He did not move for a long moment, afraid that if he did, the whole fragile scene might dissolve like something imagined. The final twist arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way the most painful truths often do. The caretaker who had spent 2 years raising his son in secret, feeding him, singing him to sleep, protecting him with a devotion Min-Jae could never fully repay, was a woman he had known his entire life. She was Hyun-woo's own wife, the old guard who had stood beside Min-Jae through every step of this investigation, never once revealing that his own household had been sheltering the boy the entire time, because even he had been kept in the dark for the child's protection until the danger had finally passed. Naomi returned to Seoul weeks later, not as the disgraced woman who had once been dragged onto a plane, but as the mother who had sacrificed everything, including her own reputation and years off her life, to keep her family alive. Min-Jae did not simply welcome her back. He rebuilt himself in front of her, piece by piece, acknowledging every moment he had chosen suspicion over trust, every moment his pride had made him easier to manipulate than he ever wanted to admit. The rival syndicate that had planted Soo-jin in his life did not simply disappear. Soo-jin herself vanished the night Min-Jae's investigation closed in, slipping out of the mansion before he could confront her directly, leaving behind only an empty room and the unsettling certainty that she would not give up so easily. Somewhere in Seoul, The family that had spent years trying to destroy everything Min-Jae loved was already planning their next move. And this time, they would not underestimate the woman they had once dismissed as nothing more than a foreign wife with Nopwar of her own. For now, in a quiet mansion on a hillside overlooking the city, a father held his son for the first time in 2 years, and a wife who had endured exile for a truth she was never allowed to speak finally heard the words she had waited so long for. Outside, the lights of Seoul stretched endlessly into the dark, indifferent to the war quietly reassembling itself somewhere beneath their glow. Somewhere out there, Soo-jin was already reporting back to the people who had sent her, and the Kang family's next enemy would not make the mistake of underestimating them a second time. It was not the end of the war, but it was, at last, the beginning of the truth.